They say power corrupts. But what happens when that power is divinely given? When a man is chosen by God before birth, destined to deliver a nation, yet plagued by his own inner chaos? What happens when strength becomes both a gift and a curse? This is not just the story of a warrior. It's not just the tale of a man with supernatural strength. It's a journey into the torn soul of a deliverer, chosen by heaven, devoured by temptation. This is the untold story of Samson. Before Samson drew his first breath, his story was already being written in heaven. Israel was in bondage again, this time under the oppressive hand of the Philistines. For 40 years, the people of God cried out, not with voices of repentance, but in the silence of suffering. Then came the angel. A messenger from God appeared to a barren woman, declaring that her son would begin to deliver Israel. The child was to be a Nazirite from the womb. No razor would touch his head. He would drink no wine, eat nothing unclean. He would be set apart. But being set apart isn't the same as being obedient. From a young age, Samson was different. His strength, unearthly. He tore lions with his bare hands. He struck down armies with the jawbone of a donkey. He carried city gates on his shoulders like twigs. Yet the mystery isn't in what he could do. It's in who he was becoming. Samson's story is soaked in paradox. He was consecrated, yet reckless. Destined for deliverance, yet addicted to destruction. He wandered through vineyards, though forbidden to touch the fruit. He touched carcasses, though commanded to avoid death. And he loved women who belonged to his enemies. Why? Why would a man so chosen, so gifted, play so close to the edge? Because Samson was Israel, not just their hero, but their mirror. Blessed, yet rebellious. Called, yet compromised. His love for a Philistine woman in Timnah wasn't just romantic folly. It was a symbol of spiritual betrayal. Against his parents' counsel, he pursued her, demanding her as his wife. On the way, he met a lion. He killed it effortlessly. Later, he found honey in the carcass, sweetness in death, and ate it. Then he gave it to his parents, but never told them its source. He broke his vow, and he knew it. At the wedding, he told a riddle drawn from that hidden sin. When the Philistines solved it by threatening his wife, he erupted. 30 men dead, their clothes stripped, rage fueled by shame. A cycle was beginning, a dance between wrath and regret. Samson's wrath became legend, and so did his unpredictability. When his wife was given to another man, he tied 300 foxes together in pairs, set torches between their tails, and released them into Philistine grain fields. It was a symbolic act of chaos. He wasn't just burning crops, he was burning bridges, declaring war. The Philistines retaliated. Samson responded with blood. This wasn't just a man with muscles. This was a man unraveling before our eyes. And yet, God still used him. Not in spite of his rage, but through it. Each act of destruction pushed Israel a step closer to deliverance, even as it pulled Samson further from peace. As he continued to wage war against the Philistines, Samson became a living contradiction. The Israelites, instead of rallying behind him, became fearful of him. They were tired of Philistine retaliation and blamed Samson for provoking their overlords. Once, 3,000 men of Judah came to hand him over to the Philistines. Samson allowed himself to be bound, perhaps with a heavy heart, and led like a captive to his enemies. But when the Spirit of the Lord came upon him, he broke free, found a fresh jawbone of a donkey, and slaughtered 1,000 men. After the battle, thirsty and faint, Samson cried out to God, "You have given your servant this great victory. Must I now die of thirst and fall into the hands of the uncircumcised?" God split open a hollow place, and water came out. Even in his defiance, God provided. This moment wasn't just physical relief. It was a spiritual crack in Samson's hardened heart, a flicker of dependency. Years passed. Samson judged Israel for 20 years, but the Bible gives little detail of his reign. It is shrouded in silence, as though these years were marked by internal struggle rather than external triumph. Perhaps he battled more within himself than he ever did on the battlefield. Maybe the weight of his calling grew heavier with each compromise. We do know that he visited a prostitute in Gaza, again entering enemy territory. The Philistines planned to ambush him at dawn, but Samson arose at midnight, tore out the city gates, and carried them on his shoulders to the top of a hill. Strength still coursed through him, but wisdom, it seemed, had not yet found a home. Then came Delilah. We often reduce Delilah to a seductress with scissors, but her power wasn't in her beauty. It was in her patience. She didn't beg. She wore him down. Day after day, she asked the same question: "Where does your strength come from?" And Samson, mighty Samson, toyed with her, lied to her, until one day he didn't. Why did he tell her? Did he long to be known? Did he want to be caught? Was he tired of pretending? His confession was more than a moment of weakness. It was a surrender of identity. When the razor touched his hair, it wasn't just his strength that left. It was his covering, his calling. He became like any other man. The Philistines captured him, gouged out his eyes, paraded him in mockery. The once feared warrior now blinded, shackled, and reduced to grinding grain in prison. But even here, in the shadow of humiliation, God was not done. In that prison cell, something happened. His hair began to grow, but more importantly, so did his heart. Broken, blind, and brought low, Samson remembered the God of his youth. Not the God of performances, but the God of mercy. Time passed. The Philistines celebrated his fall. A feast was prepared in the temple of Dagon, their false god. Thousands gathered. Drunk on pride, they called for Samson to entertain them, a blind clown, a trophy of conquest. Led by a young boy, Samson was positioned between the great pillars of the temple. And in that moment, his last moment, Samson prayed, "Sovereign Lord, remember me. Please, God, strengthen me just once more." It was not the voice of arrogance, but of humility, not of vengeance alone, but of redemption. And with that prayer, Samson pushed. The ground trembled, the pillars cracked, and the temple collapsed. Thousands died, including Samson. He killed more enemies in that moment than he had in his entire life. But more than that, he died knowing who he really was. Not a legend, not a brute, a servant, a flawed, broken, used by God's servant. But what if Samson had lived longer? What if the end of his story wasn't collapse, but recovery? We're left to wonder, because that's what the story of Samson does. It doesn't tie every thread neatly. It leaves us wrestling. Perhaps that's the point. We often read the Bible for heroes, but Samson wasn't written to be idolized. He was written to be studied, to serve as a warning and a window, a warning of the dangers of unchecked desire, and a window into the heart of God, a God who doesn't abandon us in our weakness but meets us there. Let's imagine for a moment what those silent years of Samson's judgeship may have held. The scriptures say he led Israel for 20 years, but what was that like? Perhaps in between battles, Samson tried to live normally, to settle into the role of a judge, a leader, a protector. But how does a man who has lived so violently adjust to peace? Could he? Did he wrestle with isolation, with regret, with the knowledge that his greatest victories were stained with personal failure? We tend to focus on Samson's strength as if it defined him, but strength was never meant to be the story. The deeper story was always about surrender. If Samson had learned to rule his passions the way he ruled his enemies, imagine how much more powerful his legacy might have been. But even in his failure, God's hand remained. That is perhaps the greatest comfort in the tragedy of Samson. Grace lingered. And what of Delilah? We paint her as a villain, and she was, but her presence reveals something deeper about Samson's vulnerabilities. She represents the allure of the world, persistent, beautiful, deceptive. But Samson wasn't just deceived. He was desperate. Desperate to be loved, to be known, to rest. And in that desperation, he let down his guard. Many of us can relate. The final scene in the Temple of Dagon is more than a moment of revenge. It's a moment of resurrection. Blind, broken, forgotten by man, Samson was remembered by God. When he asked for strength, just once more, it wasn't a warrior's cry. It was a son reaching for his father. In his death, Samson did what he could not do in life: fully trust. That final push was more than physical. It was spiritual. It was the exhale of a soul finally surrendered. And that is why Samson's name appears in Hebrews 11, the Hall of Faith. Despite everything, despite all the failure, all the chaos, all the compromise, he is remembered as a man of faith. Because faith is not perfection. It's dependence. Faith is trusting God even when we've fallen, especially when we've fallen. So how do we apply Samson's story today? If you're a leader wrestling with hidden battles, take heed. Strength without discipline will always lead to destruction. But discipline without love leads to legalism. Samson's story calls us to balance, to let strength be tempered by wisdom and calling be governed by character. If you're someone who feels too far gone, chained by poor choices, or haunted by your past, let Samson remind you, God is not finished with you. He redeems stories others have thrown away. He writes new endings for broken beginnings. And if you're someone who's gifted, who's been called, anointed, chosen, understand this. Your gift is not your identity. Your calling is not your covering. Without intimacy with God, your strength becomes your snare. Samson's life wasn't clean and it wasn't easy, but it was real. It was human. And through its cracks, we see the unrelenting mercy of God. Maybe that's the real story, not just of Samson, but of all of us. Samson's story is not one of flawless heroism. It is a divine tragedy, a reflection of the human condition, of strength without surrender, of calling without character, but also of redemption without merit. He was impulsive, emotional, violent, and chosen. His story reminds us that God often chooses the unlikely, the unruly, and even the unworthy to accomplish his purposes. Samson didn't fit the mold of a traditional leader. He was a puzzle of contradictions, but God was never confused. He sees the end from the beginning. And even in death, Samson pointed forward. His life foreshadowed a greater deliverer, one who would also be betrayed for silver, mocked by enemies, stretched out between two beams, and win victory through sacrifice. That deliverer was Jesus. Where Samson fell short, Christ fulfilled. So what do we learn from the untold story of Samson? We learn that destiny doesn't guarantee success, that anointing requires surrender, that strength without discipline is dangerous. But we also learn that God's mercy reaches beyond our worst mistakes, that even in ruin, redemption is possible. His life whispers to every soul who has ever blown their chances, wasted their gifts, or wandered too far. It's not over. If you still have breath, you can still cry out. You can still fulfill your purpose, even if it's at the end, even if it's broken, even if you failed. Samson's legacy reminds us that God can work through wreckage, that he sees beyond our falls, that the final chapter is his to write. So, if you're carrying shame, if you feel chained by regret, remember Samson. And remember this, God doesn't only use the perfect, he redeems the willing. Thank you for joining us in uncovering the untold story of Samson. If this story spoke to you, moved you, or made you see yourself in a new light, share it. Like, comment, and subscribe for more deep dives into the lives of the Bible's most mysterious figures. Until next time, keep wrestling, keep rising, and never stop believing in the God who sees purpose in your pain.